A little boy was playing at being a mage, while another child pretended to be a monster. In the middle of their game, he ended up tapping her on the head, which made the girl question how he could hit her for real. The boy replied simply that monsters are supposed to lose to mages, as if that were an obvious rule of the world. The village elder, Haram Burke, watched the scene and commented that they were quite energetic that morning. The boy then took the opportunity to ask the old man what he needed to do to become a mage. Haram Burke explained that it wasn't something one could become just by wanting it, because mages were the pinnacle of humanity, those who held the highest positions, nobles and knights, who had inherited mysterious powers from their ancestors. He made it clear that ordinary children like them could not simply become mages. One of the adults present found it strange that he said that so bluntly to the children, but the conversation soon shifted when someone mentioned that a monster had appeared nearby. Haram Burke confirmed it, saying that Hopi had encountered the creature the previous night, describing it as a gigantic leopard the size of a house, with a body covered in a pitch-black shadow. Even so, he tried to reassure everyone, explaining that the village chief had already gone to the city to ask a mage for help, and that this mage would surely be able to deal with the monster. In the meantime, everyone should avoid the forest, especially the children, because without a mage it would be almost impossible to kill such a creature. One of the adults asked if everyone in the village was already aware of the situation, and Haram Burke said yes, but the man insisted, asking if even the shepherd on the hill knew. Meanwhile, that very shepherd, Turin, was lying on one of his sheep beside his dog, bored with the repetition of the same scenery and routine every day. He thought that at this rate he might even forget how to speak, since he barely interacted with anyone. At that moment, Haram Burke showed up, complaining that he really was lazy, since the sun hadn't even begun to set and he was already resting. Turin replied irritably, telling the old man to move because he was blocking the sunlight. Haram Burke then asked if he was still resentful about a past incident, mentioning his mother's death and the issue with the sheep he had tried to turn into shared property. Turin admitted that he was, saying he wasn't generous enough to share his inheritance, and that they weren't close enough to be discussing such matters. He told the old man to just say what he wanted and leave. Haram Burke then explained that a monster had appeared, a giant leopard seen by Hopi, and that he was warning everyone in the village. Turin acknowledged that it was a serious problem but showed no fear, which made the elder remark that he would likely be the most probable target for living in isolation, though he couldn't say where that courage came from. Still, he emphasized that the village chief had already gone to fetch a mage and said he had come there out of concern for him. Turin retorted that he wasn't being honest and was actually worried about the sheep, not him, telling the old man to leave. Haram Burke walked away irritated, while Turin remained thinking about monsters, reflecting that they were the counterparts to mages. Just as humans had mages, beasts had monsters. He wondered if he might finally get the chance to see a real mage, though he suspected that one summoned by a rural village chief probably wouldn't be very impressive. Suddenly, Turan smelled blood and decided to head toward the forest, exactly where the monster would be. On the way, he found Haram Burke's body, completely destroyed, split in half and covered in blood. Despite the warning to be careful, the old man had been caught first. Judging by the severity of the wounds, Turan concluded it could only be the work of a monster. Soon after, he heard something approaching, until the creature appeared, just as described, a gigantic leopard shrouded in shadows. Back in the village, the boy who had been playing as a mage asked his father how strong a monster was, and whether even adults couldn't defeat one. The father replied that if an ordinary person like him encountered a monster, not even bones would be left, but tried to reassure his son by saying the village chief would bring a mage and everything would be fine. The boy wanted to be sure that the mage would win and punish the monster, and the father guaranteed it, explaining that mages were powerful beings capable of defeating monsters with just a single word. In the forest, when the monster lunged at Turan, he simply told it to die, and for a moment it recoiled, as if it might actually obey. He found it strange when it didn't fully work, and when he tried again with a command to stop, he realized the monster could resist, concluding it was a strong creature. When the leopard attacked with its claws, Turan dodged and did what he knew best as a shepherd. He grabbed his sling, hardened a stone with magical words, and increased the speed of his shot. At the right moment, he launched the attack with enough force to tear off half of the monster's head, yet the creature still advanced to devour him, so he adjusted his attack, saying he was aiming for the head, causing the stone to return and completely crush the monster, finally bringing it down. After the fight, Turan admitted to himself that it was the first time he had used that kind of power against a monster, and he began to wonder what to do with the body, imagining that the villagers would probably make him deal with it. It became clear that he was a mage, something he had discovered as a child. At the age of 8, he had realized his abilities, and by 10 he could already use them, having shown everything to his mother, saying he could control fire, wind, and move objects. That memory stood out because it was the first time his mother had truly been angry. She said she needed to talk to him, and asked if he wanted to keep living with her for a long time. For that to happen, he had to promise never to use those powers in front of other people. She explained that those with such power were called mages, divided between nobles and knights. The nobles were descendants of a divine people called the Frasians, while knights came from the mixing of that blood with humans. Even so, she warned him not to use his powers, because he had inherited his ability from his father, who was a knight, and there were still many cruel nobles outside the village who treated knights like slaves. For that reason, no one could ever discover that he was a mage, and she made him promise to keep it a secret. 8 years passed, and Turan, now an adult, continued to keep the promise he had made to his mother, with no intention of revealing his powers or leaving the hill where he lived. However, the next morning, people banged aggressively on his door. The villagers accused him of having killed Haram Burke, saying he was shameless for not even trying to deny it, claiming he had injured the old man and left him to be devoured by the monster. Turan responded calmly, saying it made sense for them to think that way, since the oldest man in the village had died alone while the youngest also lived in isolation, and blaming someone like him was the easiest way to ease everyone's conscience. He even questioned who had sent the old man up the hill to speak with him. One of the men lunged at Turan, trying to punch him, but he easily dodged, even finding it convenient how magic helped in moments like that, and quickly retaliated with a headbutt. For him, it was enough to strongly wish for something to happen, as long as it consumed mana. So, almost whispering, he wished for one of the men to fall and drop his weapon, while dodging the strike of a club that came next. Turan didn't need to do anything flashy, no need to start a fire or anything excessive. A small spark was enough, something subtle enough not to raise suspicion, and also not to kill anyone. And so, he fought the villagers using their own clubs, dodging, disarming them, and even making them hit their own heads. For 8 years, he had lived like that, using these methods to hide the fact that he was a mage. After knocking everyone down, Turan remarked that they should spend that energy on Haram Burke's funeral, and even asked the women standing further back if they had also come to fight. They replied that they hadn't, that they only wanted to see how he was doing, so he told them to take those idiots away. When he returned home, he thought that this would only create more trouble in the village, as always, and that they would probably use it as an excuse to harm him in the next trade. But he was already used to it. He just had to push until he got a fair deal. He imagined that after that beating, they would take a while to come back, but soon someone knocked on the door again. He opened it already irritated, thinking it was the same people, but instead of villagers, he found a completely different man. The stranger introduced himself as a traveler, and Turan apologized for the way he had opened the door, explaining that he had just dealt with some unwelcome visitors. He remembered the manners his mother had taught him, though he admitted he didn't always manage to apply them properly. He had never met anyone from outside the village, and he quickly noticed that the man carried a sword, something unusual there. Even so, he invited the traveler in, asking if he was looking for an inn. Later, with food already served, Turan commented that he didn't have much to offer, but the traveler said it was more than enough, and was surprised to learn that Turan had never left the village. Turan confirmed that he had been born and raised there, living as a shepherd all his life, but the man noticed that he had good manners, assuming his parents must have taught him well. Turan explained that he had learned everything from his mother, who had died a few years earlier from an illness. The traveler made a respectful gesture, thanking him for the food and lodging. Then Turan asked what brought someone like him to such an isolated village, and the man replied that he was there because of a request. They were looking for someone to deal with a monster. He then revealed that he was a mage. Hearing this, Turan asked if he was the mage the elder had mentioned, and the man confirmed it, but also showed some confusion. He said he could sense the presence of a monster in the region but couldn't find it, and what was even stranger was that Turan seemed calm despite knowing about the situation. Anyone else would be afraid, especially someone who lived in isolation, but he seemed more irritated than frightened, so the man ended up asking directly who he really was. At that moment, Turan remembered a conversation with his mother, when he had asked why no one could know he was a mage. She explained that there were cruel nobles, comparing them to shepherds and knights to dogs, who could be treated like family or discarded when convenient. She didn't want him to have that kind of life, which was why he had to promise never to reveal his powers, especially to other mages. If they found out, they might separate them, and turn him into someone subordinate to them. Turan had always known that. To keep this secret, he might one day even have to kill someone if necessary. The traveler broke the silence, asking why he wasn't answering, joking that otherwise his joke would lose its humor. Turan simply replied that he didn't have much of a sense of humor. The man apologized, saying he might have misunderstood things, and Turan commented that it was the first time he had heard a joke from a mage. The traveler found his reaction amusing, and decided to introduce himself, saying his name was Kiorn and that he was a wanderer, while Turan introduced himself as the shepherd of the hill. Later, during dinner, Turan mentioned that he would turn 18 that year, and Kiorn revealed that he was 75, explaining that mages aged more slowly than ordinary people. Turan asked how he had become a wanderer, and Kiorn explained that he had served the Badal Arabian family for 60 years before deciding to leave, wanting to spend the rest of his life traveling without being tied to one place. The two ended up having a light, carefree conversation, something that surprised Turan, who had never imagined it could be so pleasant to talk like that with someone. By the end of the day, as the sun was setting, Kiorn said he would be leaving, and placed a silver coin on the table to pay for the food and lodging. Turan thanked him and wished him a good hunt, but Kiorn replied that there was no need need to act as if they would never see each other again, since he still intended to wander around that region. The next morning, Turin was in a good mood, tending to his sheep and thinking that it had been the first time he had met another mage, and more than that, had a comfortable conversation with someone. He was even surprised at himself for opening up like that, feeling it had been better than any interaction he had ever had with other adults. Over time, Kiorn came back a few times to Turin's house, and this made him begin to question his own beliefs. He had always thought that knights were like emotionless dogs, serving arrogant nobles, but perhaps Kiorn was an exception. Even so, he didn't know how to tell the man that there were no more monsters on the hill, while Kiorn continued searching for the creature, following traces and signs of battle, even though he could no longer sense the monster's presence. On one of those days, Kiorn found clear signs of battle, but no active presence, leading him to suspect that the monster had already been killed, perhaps by another mage sent by the village chief. To him, that wouldn't be a problem, since what mattered was the safety of the place. However, he soon noticed something strange approaching. It was the same giant leopard, but with a disfigured face and a completely different energy, which made Kiorn realize it was a monster specter. The creature attacked immediately, and Kiorn dodged while thinking that when a dead monster's mana is not absorbed or dispersed, it can turn into a specter, something any mage who hunts monsters should know. That meant whoever had killed the creature was also a mage, but for some reason had failed to deal with the body properly. To Kiorn, that made no sense, since even a novice knight would know that. He began to consider that perhaps the one responsible had other intentions in letting this happen. Even so, Kiorn decided to act and charged an electric arrow to finish the monster, but the instant he tried to use his magic, the mana was simply dissipated, as if it had been nullified, and the creature vanished. In the next moment, it reappeared, attacking from Kiorn's own shadows and catching him off guard. He managed to defend himself, but still took damage, immediately realizing that this was no ordinary monster, certainly not something a mere knight could handle. It would require at least someone at the level of a low-ranking noble. Still, it didn't make sense, because whoever had defeated the creature before had not absorbed its mana, allowing it to become a specter. To Kiorn, it was absurd to think he would face something of that level in such an isolated village, yet it also showed how unpredictable the world could be. Before him stood a distorted version of what had once been a leopard, now reduced to a grotesque mass of flesh and energy. Even knowing the risk, Karen decided that if he were to die there, he would take the monster with him. He concentrated all his electrical mana into his hand, waiting for the right moment to strike directly when the creature lunged, and so he did, attempting to counter its claw attack with his own electrical discharge. However, before he could complete the attack, something exploded in the monster's head, once, and then again, finally finishing it off. At that moment, Turan appeared, asking if Kiorn was alright. Still recovering, Kiorn remarked that a shepherd's joke was better than a mage's, recognizing who he was. He then asked directly whether Turan had been a mage all along, and why he hadn't said anything, but quickly changed the question, wanting to know why Turan had chosen to help him instead of simply walking away. That made Turan recall an earlier conversation, when Kiorn had returned with the body of a wolf, and he had asked why the mage worked so hard for such a small village, since with his abilities he could live much more comfortably. At the time, Kiorn had replied that those people lived in fear on the frontier, without any protection, and that a mage, by wielding near-divine power, should take pride in protecting the weak, though he acknowledged that each mage had their own way of living. So now, Turan answered that he helped simply because everyone chooses their own path. Even without a head, the specter continued to move and tried to attack them again, forcing both of them to dodge. Kiorn realized that this was beyond what they could handle easily, stating that it was the kind of monster that would normally require a noble to defeat. He suggested that someone should inform the village chief while he held the creature back, but Turan said it wasn't necessary, believing his earlier attack had already secured the advantage. Kiorn began to suspect that Turan might be a young knight hiding in the mountains, but soon realized it was something far greater than that. This wasn't just a chance encounter with someone talented, nor the recklessness of a rebellious youth. It was the beginning of something rare, a mage with the potential to change the world. Meanwhile, Turan admitted that he too was curious to understand his own limits, but Kiorn didn't want to let him fight alone, insisting they would join forces against that enemy. However, when the creature attacked again, Turan intervened so quickly that Kiorn realized he would only get in the way if he stayed there, since he hadn't even managed to react to the last blow. At that moment, he understood his role was different, to help Turan's talent develop. Turan then began attacking with intense beams of mana combined with stones from the ground, causing visible damage, but still not enough to bring down the specter. That was when Kiorn explained that specters do not die from physical attacks, and that the only way to destroy them was by using fire or lightning. Turan tried to summon fire but couldn't do it properly, and Kiorn explained that the problem wasn't just creating the magic, but understanding how to apply it. To affect a living being, it was necessary to establish the proper relationship between cause and effect. He began to realize that Turan lacked this basic knowledge, reinforcing the idea that he himself had defeated the monster before without knowing how to handle its mana, allowing it to become a specter. Even so, it was impressive that someone without that knowledge possessed such power. Kiorn then instructed Turan not just to create fire, but to shape and launch it, explaining that creating was easy for a mage, but control was the difficult part. Even so, Turin immediately managed to form a sphere surrounded by a ring of fire and fired it like a projectile, striking the creature directly. The impact ignited the specter, which began to writhe and scream as it burned. Kyoran urged him to stay focused and continue feeding the flames with mana until the monster was completely destroyed. After some time, that was exactly what happened. The creature was reduced to charred remains and began to dissipate, leaving Kyorn impressed with the result, since they had defeated an extremely powerful specter. Even so, he warned that to prevent this from happening again, it was necessary to absorb the remaining mana. Turan, who had never done that before, didn't know how to proceed. Kyorn explained that he simply had to imagine the mana being drawn into himself, and that was what Turan did, successfully absorbing the energy for the first time. Upon seeing that, Cairn was surprised and explained that a mage's mana normally grows slowly after awakening, expanding mainly by absorbing energy from monsters or other mages. Yet even though it was Turan's first time, he already displayed a level of power far above the norm, indicating a rare and extraordinary talent. After that, Cairn apologized for the way he had treated Turan and asked which house he came from, but Turan simply told him to take care of his own wound first, as he was bleeding heavily. Later, while bandaging Cairn's arm, he apologized again, saying he had been rude to someone so remarkable, but Turan rejected that, stating he was no one special, just a shepherd who didn't even know his own father, and asked him to stop treating him that way. Even so, Kyorn insisted on understanding why someone with so much power would choose to live as a shepherd, and Turin explained that it was his mother's request. She feared the nobles who lived below the mountain, believing that if they discovered his ability, they would only use him. Kyorn agreed that his mother was wise, explaining that great power inevitably brings conflict, and he spoke of a war that had occurred about 20 years earlier between the Badal Arabian family, whom he served, and House Zahar. He recalled that thousands died in that war, including around 900 knights from his own house, nearly a third of their forces. Among them were people close to him, such as his friend Denver, who dreamed of opening a laundry shop, his teacher Hartman, who always corrected him, as well as his own wife and son, all of whom were killed in the conflict, while he was the sole survivor of his squad. Because of this, he acknowledged that Turan's mother was right to fear such a fate, since a knight's life could be lost so meaninglessly. Even so, he pointed out that there was something she was mistaken about. Turan's talent was not ordinary. It was not merely that of a skilled knight, but something far greater. He stated that Turan's potential was, at the very least, on the level of a noble, and possibly among the most talented of them. Turan commented that his mother had always said his father was a knight, which left him confused, wondering if that might have been a lie. Kyorn explained that in rare cases a child can be born with less talent than knights, even if they come from a noble family, or the opposite, someone can be born with more talent than nobles, despite coming from knights. With that in mind, he said it might be better for Turan to leave that hill and go out into the world, because humanity still needs more knights and nobles, as they have not yet fully mastered this world. He continued, explaining that in the past, the ancient races were driven out by the gods and are still waiting for a chance to reclaim the power they once had at their peak. Even so, instead of seeking evolution, enlightenment, or magic, nobles and knights themselves keep fighting among each other, spilling their own blood. That is why, according to Kieran, this era needs people like Turan. After that, he asked whether the boy was truly satisfied living as a simple shepherd. Turan then asked what he could gain by going down the mountain, and Kieran replied that it depended on what he desired, whether it be wealth, fame, power, or even things like family and friendship. He explained that living isolated in that place made it difficult to obtain any of those things. He said Turan could imagine himself traveling the world, defeating beasts that threaten people, becoming an explorer in unknown lands, or even being adopted by a noble family and following the path of power. As Turan accompanied Kyorn outside the house, he remarked that, hearing all that, it sounded far more interesting than tending sheep, and for the first time he became truly curious about the world beyond. Kyorn, on the other hand, felt somewhat concerned that he might have created too many expectations in him, but still said he would be rooting for him. Then he asked what the boy's lineage ability was, saying he should have asked that earlier. Turan had no idea what that meant, so Kyorn apologized, and explained that lineage abilities are traits inherited from ancestors, the Phrygians, and that this is what usually separates nobles from knights. He then asked if the boy had any spell that was unusually easy for him to use or any surprising ability. Turan suggested that perhaps he was just physically strong, but Kyorn explained that didn't count, since any noble or knight has enhanced strength due to mana. The boy then said he had a keen sense of smell and was skilled at throwing stones, and Kyorn replied that this could indeed be considered a trait, as proficiency with thrown weapons is common among the Badal Arabian, though not particularly rare. After hearing more details, Kyorn began to grow slightly concerned and remarked that Turan's abilities resembled those of the great house known as the Hunters, House Zagar, which was precisely the family he had fought against in the war. This made Turan uncomfortable, as he might be connected to his veteran's enemy house, and he didn't know how to react, even wondering if he should apologize despite having no relation to it. Kieran then told him to stop making that worried expression, explaining that he hadn't even taken part in the war, and that such matters were for adults. adults. He commented that if people keep trying to repay blood with blood, conflicts will never end. Even so, Turan asked if he didn't regret suggesting that he go down the hill. Kiorn admitted that yes, there was such a risk, because if Turan sought power, he would likely end up joining House Zagar. Still, he said he trusted the boy's character, recalling that he had saved him even knowing the secret he carried. To Kiorn, if someone like Turan were to reach a high position within House Zagar, he might even prevent a war like the previous one. In the end, he said there was no need to think too much about it right now. Even so, Turan stated that his mind was already made up. He wanted to go down the mountain, but only after Kiorn's wound had healed. Kiorn found that kind and recognized that he truly was a good person. Later, while they were together, Kiorn began to explain magic in more detail, saying that mana is its fuel, which is why it is called the key to omnipotence, even though it is not truly absolute power. He explained that to use magic, mana must be properly shaped to match the desired effect. Turan then asked what the standard for that was, and Kiorn explained that the difficulty of magic depends on three main factors: lineage, affinity, and causality. Lineage comes from birth and defines certain natural abilities, such as in the case of some southern bloodlines that can heal wounds without training, simply because they possess that inherited power. Affinity, on the other hand, is linked to familiarity. Mages are better at using what they are already accustomed to. Turan recalled that when he used fire before, he did so as if he were throwing a weapon, and Kiorn confirmed that this was exactly why it worked, since he adapted the magic to something he already understood. Finally, he spoke about causality, admitting that even he did not fully understand the concept. He then asked what would happen if Turan tried to kill someone using mana directly. The boy replied that he imagined something like a light coming out of his head, and Kiorn explained that this is what happens when there is no proper cause for the desired effect. He said that when something is too difficult to happen, it is necessary to create a logical cause for it. Turan concluded that, to kill someone, it would not be enough to simply wish it with mana. He would need to create a means, such as generating fire and launching it, since that is more natural than directly producing the effect. Kiorn confirmed that he understood well, even suggesting that he might become a scholar rather than a mage. In the end, Turan commented that he could control ordinary animals with ease, but did not understand why magical beasts required something different. Kiorn explained that this is because such creatures also possess mana within themselves. After all these explanations, Turan realized that magic was far from simple. Kiorn agreed, saying that a truly excellent mage not only knows how to use mana, but also understands the principles and circumstances behind it. Turan then asked what the special magic of the Zahar lineage was, and Kiorn replied that it involved stealth and tracking abilities, suggesting that he try to use it. Turan concentrated, wishing not to be seen by anyone, and that no sound or scent could be detected. Soon a thick mist covered his body, and he asked if it had worked. Kiorn replied that he could not even see him, and said it was downright terrifying. Then Turan simply reappeared in midair, and Kiorn remarked that it had been a long time since he last saw that ability, reinforcing how frightening it was. He explained that during the war, this was precisely the power that the Knights of Battle Arabion feared the most. Turan thought it was unfairly powerful, but Kiorn warned that it was not invincible. After that, he began teaching some methods of magical training. Turan questioned whether it wasn't too much to teach all that to someone who might belong to an enemy family, and the veteran replied that Turan had saved his life and even taken care of him, and that he trusted the boy's character. Later, Turan informed the village that he would sell the sheep and leave, which confused the people, who asked who would take care of the flock and how he could decide that on his own. Turan replied that they should find another shepherd themselves, and that what he did with what was his was none of their concern. He also made it clear that he expected a fair price for the sheep, otherwise he would release them all and let them try to capture them if they wished. The village chief realized that Turan was someone who followed through on his words and that it was not worth provoking him, so he decided to pay for the sheep and let him go. Thus, Turan set out together with Kiorn, asking if he still owed any compensation. Kiorn replied that he did not intend to receive anything, since it was he who had defeated the monster. The two then acknowledged that they would follow separate paths. Kiorn apologized for refusing to travel together, explaining that he felt more comfortable alone, and Turan said he understood, thanking him for everything. Kiorn told him to take care, and Turan replied that he hoped to meet him again someday. He watched Kiorn's figure walk away for a long time. Only later did Turan realize why he had not wanted the old knight to speak so formally. Even though he had received affection from his mother, deep down he had always longed for a father figure, someone who could serve as an example of the kind of man he wanted to become. With that in mind, Turan continued on his journey. During his travels, he crossed canyons in a vast and hostile desert. At one point, he encountered a group of people and assumed they were merchants traveling between villages, so he asked where the nearest city was. One of them replied that he only needed to head in the opposite direction to reach a city called Mure. Turan thanked them and was about to leave when another man stepped in front of him, questioning whether he was really going to leave with just that information, saying he should give something in return. It soon became clear that those merchants were actually bandits. The leader explained that they were in a remote place with no one around and implied that it would be strange if the boy left unscathed. He ordered Turin to hand over his belongings while they were still being kind. Turin understood the situation and remembered the training on how to use magic against people, deciding to put it into practice. The bandits laughed at him, finding it absurd that he acted like a mage, but Turin responded by guiding the wind with his mana, knocking all of them down along with their weapons and belongings. He realized that instead of creating wind out of nothing, it was far more efficient to shape the wind that already existed. Next, he opened his water skin and turned the water into ice, creating needles that pierced one of the bandits. Although he found it interesting, he concluded that ice was only useful when there was water nearby, and that throwing stones was still faster and more efficient. One of the older bandits tried to beg for forgiveness, saying they didn't know he was a mage and that he would give him anything he wanted. However, it was only a distraction, as others attempted to attack him from behind. With a simple movement, Turan made spikes of sand rise from the ground, eliminating them all. The last bandit surrendered, and Turan asked why they had attacked without a better plan, since he could have been a mage. The man replied that it was because Turan had lowered his head and acted politely, which made him seem like an ordinary person. Turan recognized that this was an important lesson. The bandit then asked if he would be spared, but Turan had already prepared a small drop of water above his head. He remembered Kaorn's advice that along his journey he would meet many people, but he should never show mercy to scum like bandits, people who do not hesitate to harm others for profit. Turan understood the reasoning behind that, realizing that sparing a criminal could result in the deaths of many innocent people. Even so, after everything, he continued on his way carrying a weight on his conscience, feeling guilty for having taken lives, yet knowing he could not leave them alive. He kept following the marks left by the bandits' wagon before the wind and sand erased them. Over time, the landscape began to change, becoming greener, with grass appearing along the path, until he finally arrived at a new place. Turan reached the city of Murray, a small city, but to him it seemed enormous, since he had spent his entire life in an isolated village. It was the first time he had seen so many people gathered in one place, and he also noticed how the architecture was completely different, confirming that he had truly arrived at a city like those he had heard about in stories. As he approached a merchant to ask a question without buying anything, he remembered Charon's advice about looking for an inn. The merchant, however, responded rudely, telling him to leave if he wasn't going to buy anything. Turan then realized there was an unspoken rule that one must purchase something before asking for information. So, he bought an apple for 2 ducats using the coins he had from the village, and the merchant accepted, explaining that to find an inn he just needed to follow the road behind the cloak shop, turn left, and look for a building with a blue roof. Following the directions, Turan arrived at the Lena Inn, where he was well received by a girl, and managed to get a room for 16 ducats. He also asked if there were any monsters nearby with bounties, since he knew he needed to defeat monsters to absorb mana and also earn money, as Kaorn had explained. However, the girl did not answer directly, and simply made it clear that, in that world, nothing comes for free. Later, the attendant began to explain about the city hall, but Turan didn't even know what that was. The girl noticed and commented that he really was from the countryside, then explained that the city hall handles the city's public affairs, and that the officials who work there serve the local lord. She also said that since the sun had already set, the place would probably be closed, and that if he wanted to take on monster bounties, he would have to go there the next day. Then she asked if he was also a monster hunter, mentioning that some people believe that by hunting many monsters, a person can become a mage, though she herself didn't take that idea very seriously. At that moment, Madon appeared, saying that it was true that a person really could become a mage by killing monsters, because he had seen it with his own eyes. The attendant found it strange, and asked if he was still alive, and Madon replied that he had no intention of dying before becoming a mage. Turan, finding that interesting, moved his hand aside and asked to hear more about the story. Madan then explained that mages grow stronger by hunting monsters, and by the same principle, an ordinary person could also become a mage by doing the same. He said that he and his group were hunting monsters for that very purpose. Turan asked if anyone in the group had already succeeded, and Madan replied that not yet, adding that in the city there was only the Lord's mage and 3 subordinates. Next, Madan asked if Turan also hunted monsters, noting that his equipment was far too simple, and that he barely seemed to have a weapon. Turan replied that he did, showing his sling. Madan noticed from the wear that it was frequently used and commented that with it, he could easily kill smaller creatures. Taking the opportunity, he mentioned that the group needed another marksman, and asked if Turan was interested. Turan declined, thanking him for the offer, as he saw no reason to join them. He was still processing everything that had happened that day, barely believing that he had left the village, and unsure of what the future held. It was then that he heard an extremely subtle sound, something few people would notice. He remembered Karen's advice that he should never lower his guard, not even inside an inn, because cities are not automatically safe. Already gathering mana in the palm of his hand, Turan opened the door and found Lena, who asked if he was already asleep. She said she thought he might be cold, and had come to keep him warm. Turan didn't immediately understand what that meant, and asked directly, and Lena replied that it was exactly what it it sounded like. He then said he didn't want anything like that, and she commented that she could tell by his expression, saying he looked like a Buddha. Turin remembered another piece of Kyorn's advice, to be careful with maids and prostitutes, as many could carry diseases or even pose a danger depending on the situation. After firmly dismissing Lena, he reflected that living in the city was not easy, since even small things like information and conversations came at a cost, making the environment colder and more calculating. Shortly after, he heard voices in the corridor and realized it was Midan with his group. Some were questioning why the leader had considered recruiting Turan, saying he didn't seem very useful. Midan, however, replied that the boy reminded him of himself in his youth, and that when he saw the weapon he used, he became concerned, thinking that if the boy stayed with them, he might survive longer. The others mocked him, saying he was too soft. Hearing that, Turan realized that, despite everything, the city wasn't completely heartless. The next morning, he went to City Hall and told the official he wanted to hunt monsters. He remembered what Kyorn had said, that the world wouldn't be kind to him unless he showed strength, like revealing himself as a mage. The clerk then showed him a document, making it clear that he couldn't take it, only read and return it. The target was a monster described as a crow, with blade-like wings. He explained that if Turan managed to kill it, he should bring back the corpse and disperse its mana. Otherwise, the body could turn into a specter. He also warned that abandoning a monster's corpse could lead even to execution under the city's laws. Turan already knew that very well and had no intention of making such a mistake. He also asked why knights didn't do this kind of work, and the official replied that they didn't have time for it, as their role was to maintain public order, while hunting monsters outside the city was left to people like him. After Turan left, the clerk remarked that another corpse would show up soon, and that was exactly what happened. Before long, Turan returned with the body of the blade-winged crow. The staff were surprised by how quickly he came back, and even more so to see that the wings were intact. When he asked about the reward, one of the officials quickly brought a bag of coins. Even so, Turan didn't leave and asked if there were more monsters available, surprising everyone, who questioned whether he still had the energy to keep hunting. Sometime later, he was at the inn eating the most expensive items on the menu that Lena had brought him. She commented that she had never imagined someone like him could defeat 30 monsters in just 3 days, and that he must have earned a lot of money. Turan replied that money wasn't his only goal. What he truly sought was the monster's mana. He realized that, thanks to the hunts, he had become much stronger, with his mana increasing several times over since meeting Kyorn. Still, he felt there was a limit, a kind of barrier he wouldn't be able to overcome just by hunting weak monsters. While he ate, Lena remarked that despite being thin, he ate very well, and the owner said he was glad Turan liked the food. Turan stood up, satisfied, but was soon approached by some members of Midan's group, who began provoking him, asking why he was eating alone, and implying that since he was making money, he could help the others. Turan didn't let it slide. He responded with a direct slap, saying that if they wanted charity, he could hand it out like that. Then he dodged another attack and knocked that man down as well. When the first tried to react again, his strike was blocked, and he took another hit. Lena tried to intervene, asking them to stop fighting. Later, Midan personally went to apologize to Turan, saying he had already reprimanded his men and that it wouldn't happen again. He explained that the group had been short on money lately and had grown envious upon seeing the boy's success. He then ordered everyone to apologize, and they obeyed. Turan then asked if their situation was really that bad, and Midan replied that he wouldn't call it desperate, but they were limited, and in about 3 days, they might not even be able to afford their stay. Turan handed a bag of money to Midan, saying it was payment for the kindness he had shown in worrying about him. Midan was puzzled and asked how he knew about that, but Turan replied that it didn't matter much, and that, in the end, nothing is free. With that money, he wanted information. Excited, Midan said that was right up his alley, and that Turan could ask as much as he wanted. The next morning, Turan was on what would likely be his last hunt in that city. Midan had given him information about the next city, so it was time to leave. In the end, Turan realized he had received far more than he expected, as Midan had truly been a good person. He wasn't as experienced as Karen, but that made him more genuine and kind. As he walked through the forest, Turan sensed a strange smell. He ran toward it and found the body of one of Midan's men. Following the trail, he realized they were all dead, including Midan himself. One of the men was still barely alive and said that the one responsible was a monster rabbit. The creature was still there, devouring one of the bodies. It was far larger than any monster Turan had hunted in that city. It had also attacked Midan. In an instant, the creature lunged and tore an entire tree out with its bite, but Turan barely managed to dodge. It was too fast, so he pulled out his sling and used wind magic to spin it faster, firing stones like a barrage of missiles. Even so, the rabbit was already used to ranged attacks and destroyed everything before they could hit. Soon after, the creature charged again like a bull, but when it looked ahead, Turan was no longer there. He vanished and reappeared behind the monster, driving a dagger into its neck. The rabbit tried to react, but Turan repeated the same strategy several times, disappearing and striking, until the monster grew exhausted and too weak. In the end, it died from blood loss. When the body finally went still, Turan absorbed the monster's mana and realized it was far greater than that of other creatures, greater even than the leopard he had faced before. The surviving man, impressed, asked if he was a mage and why he was hiding his identity. humanity. Without answering directly, Turan asked whether those 4 men had any family he could deliver their belongings to. The survivor said no, that their only family had been their leader. That made Turan remember a conversation with Midan, who had told him about a large nearby city called Oren, where there was a gigantic library with thousands of books. The detail was that only mages were allowed to enter. At that moment, Turan decided he would go to Oren. Later, he buried all the bodies and silently said that he hoped Midan was at peace, wherever he might be. After that, he joined a line of travelers waiting to enter the city and started to think it was almost embarrassing that he had been so impressed by the small town of Murray. When he finally reached Oren, he was stunned. There were too many people. He had never imagined such a long line, with guards inspecting everyone and searching for criminals. When it was his turn, a guard denied him entry because of his appearance, saying he had never seen such filthy clothes and ordering him to clean himself before trying again. Sometime later, now clean, Turan stood before an enormous tower, the library Midan had mentioned. The place had an oppressive and imposing presence, as if it had been built with magic. When he tried to enter, he said he wanted access to the library, but the guard replied that only mages were allowed inside. Turan stated that he was a mage, but the guard didn't take him seriously and called him a lunatic. He then decided to test him by trying to sense his mana, something Kieran had explained, that mages can recognize one another through mana. When Turan revealed his true energy, the guard was shocked. He even fell to the ground and realized that Turan's level was comparable to that of a noble. He then introduced himself as Mesa, of the house of Rugvaltus, and asked which house Turan belonged to. Turan questioned whether he needed to answer that to enter, and Mesa explained that he didn't, but to use the library, he would need the master's permission, so he would inform him immediately. Later, Turan felt slightly disappointed, thinking the process would be simpler, but at that moment he was being treated as a guest, being washed by maids in a bath. Feeling awkward, he asked them to stop and wondered if he couldn't wash himself, but the maids said they would be punished if they failed to properly attend a guest. With little choice, he let them continue. After that, he received formal clothes from the Rugvaltus family, and even the maids were impressed by his appearance. Someone else was also surprised, commenting that he had looked like a beggar before, but now looked like a prince. She was Azella, the young lady of the house. Turan introduced himself, and she asked which house he was from. He replied that, for personal reasons, it was difficult to say, which only increased her curiosity. Then, unexpectedly, Azella released her mana, and Turan responded in kind. The clash between the two was so intense that the maids around them wouldn't have been able to withstand it, and had to be protected. When it ended, Azella was impressed and even joked, asking if he wanted to marry her. Turan was speechless, and she laughed, saying it was just a joke, but that he could think about it. When she left, Turan noticed that his hand was trembling. Her mana was at the same level as his, perhaps even stronger, and he didn't know if that was normal for someone her age. Later, he went to the office of the man in charge of the city, Lord Rugvaltus, who asked if he wanted to use the library. He explained that many people came to Oren chasing rumors about ancient magic or secret knowledge, but made it clear that there was nothing like that there. Turan said that wasn't what he was looking for. Even so, Rugvaltus stated that he wouldn't stop him and that there was no confidential information in the library. Since it was already late, he suggested that Turan return the next day, and Turan agreed, saying he wouldn't forget the kindness. The next morning, his access was confirmed, and Turan was finally able to enter the so-called Sky Library. The name fit perfectly, as it was a gigantic tower that seemed to reach the heavens, with sunlight illuminating everything from above. Right at the entrance, he was greeted by a librarian, who seemed a bit young for the job. Even so, she explained that, by order of the Lord, she would go over the usage rules. Turan found it odd, wondering if that child was really in charge, but she continued normally. The first rule was that any damage must be compensated. The second was that no book could leave the premises. There were no loans. In addition, she warned that she would be watching him at all times while he was in the library. Turan commented that it might be a bit uncomfortable, but accepted it. Then he asked if she could help him find some books, and the librarian replied confidently that this was exactly what she was best at. The librarian asked what Turan wanted to read: romance, history, or even something more adult, since he seemed to be at that age. He refused and said he wanted to learn the basics about the world, so she brought him a huge collection of books, explaining that most of them were hundreds of years old and not very up to date, but that the material would still be very helpful. That was how Turan began reading for the first time. From then on, this became his routine in Oren. Every day he went to the library and studied non-stop. Over time, he came to understand the world's geography, the different races, the etiquette among mages, how items were crafted and processed, as well as learning about monsters and relics from the era of the ancient empire. Each new piece of knowledge made the world, once completely unknown to him, much clearer and more real. After some time, Rugvaltus remarked that Turan had made excellent use of the library and that he trusted he understood the situation. Allowing someone to use it, especially while being treated like a noble, was an act of goodwill, and because of that, he expected something in return. Turan replied that he only needed to say what he wanted. Rugvaltus then explained that a monster had appeared to the north of Oren and had been attacking travelers. 4 knights had already been sent, but they hadn't returned. Normally, a noble would have to deal with this personally, but his house could only mobilize 2 people at the moment. Torin agreed to help, saying that protecting people was also a mage's duty. Even so, he found it strange, since mages, especially nobles, don't usually get directly involved in this kind of problem. Rugvaltus explained that the northern route, an important trade road, had been blocked for 10 days and needed to be cleared as soon as possible. That's when Turan realized that this had been happening even before he arrived in the city, and was probably one of the reasons they had allowed him to use the library. Later, he set out alongside a group of mages and knights to hunt the monster. Azella was leading the party and commented, somewhat irritated, that her father must be desperate to involve even a guest in this, as if they themselves weren't trustworthy. She made it clear she wasn't blaming Turan, but that the whole situation felt messy. Another mage in the group questioned whether she wasn't exaggerating by speaking that way about her own lord. Then he greeted Turin and introduced himself as Marvin Voltus. Meanwhile, Azella just wanted to get it over with. Marvin even joked, asking if Turin was interested in his older sister, but Turin denied it, and he said that was a relief. Suddenly, Azella ordered everyone to stop. They had found a completely destroyed carriage, clearly the monster's doing. Turan examined the area and noticed a massive handprint on a tree, concluding that the creature was some kind of giant ape. He explained that the monster had likely attacked the merchants and returned to the forest, so if they followed the trail, they would find it. Azella said she didn't know how to use tracking magic, but Turin tried on his own. When she asked if he came from a specific lineage, he replied that it was just practice. He used the scent from an object in the carriage to detect the creature's mana, and followed the trail to a river, where the monster had likely washed itself to throw them off. Azella questioned whether a beast could really be that intelligent, but before Turan could answer, he realized the monster was right behind them. A gigantic ape, resembling a gorilla, began hurling stones with tremendous force. Several knights were killed instantly. Turin managed to dodge, but he noticed something worse. The Valtus siblings were using the knights as human shields to protect themselves. That made him remember his mother's words. Even so, Azella ordered an attack, but the monster was already fleeing. It was too fast even for nobles. Then Turan prepared his sling and fired a stone with enormous force, piercing straight through the monster's heart. Even so, the creature didn't die immediately, so Azella finished it off using her fire magic, creating a serpent of flames that completely burned the monster. Turan realized that was the power of the Valtus family's fire mages. The knights were relieved, saying it was finally over, but many were severely injured. Azella commented that she felt a chill when Turan's stone flew past. Meanwhile, she and her brother were practically unharmed. Turan observed that the situation had turned into chaos. Even with few deaths at that moment, many injuries could have been avoided if the weaker ones hadn't been used as shields. He also realized that, since a mage's body is strengthened by mana, those two siblings likely had great endurance, yet still chose to protect themselves at others' expense without hesitation. Marvin Valtus asked if something was wrong, but Turin said no, that he was just thinking. Soon after, Azella said it was time to absorb the monster's mana. Everyone did so together. Turin remembered what he had read, that even when multiple people absorb mana at the same time, the gain doesn't decrease. The Valtus siblings reached their limit quickly, but Turin kept absorbing. His level of magical control was clearly higher. Azella noticed this and remarked that he hadn't even reached his limit yet, despite already being at a noble's level. On the way back, Marvin said that without Turan, they would never have defeated the monster. From tracking it to landing the final blow, Turan replied that it wasn't quite like that, and that in fact he had realized too late that the monster also possessed detection abilities. Confused, Marvin asked what he meant. Turan then explained that the abilities of magical beasts vary according to their physical characteristics. That ape had enormous hands and eyes, which indicated both the strength to throw objects and the ability to see from afar. Marvin was impressed that he had noticed all that so quickly, and Turan said he had learned it by reading bestiaries in the library. Marvin commented that the library was outdated and that almost no one went there. Azella said she had gone once out of curiosity, but found the books too difficult and gave up. So Turin suggested that, if she was interested, she could ask the librarian about easier books. Azella found that strange and asked which librarian he was talking about, saying there was no one like that there. Later, when he was alone, Turan returned to the library, thinking he had been careless. In that city, no knight or commoner would dare speak to him so informally. To everyone there, someone of his level should only be addressed as your nobility. Moreover, Turan found it odd that a little girl was the librarian, so he decided to ask how she knew his name. She replied that he had only just noticed, since she had seen his license and learned his name from it, also explaining that nothing escaped her notice within the surroundings of the library. Then he asked how he should address her, and she said she had no name, that he could call her whatever he liked, even suggesting something like a cute nickname. Even so, Turan decided to call her Miss Librarian, but she found it strange that he had suddenly become polite, especially after, according to her, he had been ordering her around earlier. Turan denied this and even asked her not to get so close, because it made him uncomfortable. Next, Turan asked if she was a mage from the ancient empire, or something like that, but she explained that she wasn't even human, saying she was something like a spirit. She went on to explain that when a soul inhabits something living, it becomes a living spirit. When it inhabits something dead, it becomes a spirit of the dead, and when it inhabits nothing, it is simply a spirit. In her case, she was part of the library itself, and that appearance existed only to facilitate communication, like a reflection in water. Curious, Turan stepped closer and ended up passing his hand through her stomach, which made her complain, saying it was bizarre and irritating, especially because she couldn't directly use force against intruders. Otherwise, she would have already punished everyone who mistreated the books. Turan commented that it seemed no one in the Valtis family knew of her existence, perhaps not even anyone who had ever used the library, and she explained that no one had the qualifications to perceive her. Her creator had ensured that only people with a certain level of lineage could recognize her. In other words, only Turan could see her, something she even called romantic. Confused, he asked what kind of lineage she meant, and she replied that she was talking about the lineage of mages. So Turan asked if she could detect anything about his lineage, and requested more explanations, but she answered that he should ask his parents about that. When he said he was an orphan, she offered to examine him, but said he would need to allow her to analyze his body. He found that strange and asked her to stop talking like that. But even so, without waiting for an answer, she passed her hand through his chest, something possible for her as a spirit. After that, she explained that they were now connected and noticed certain characteristics in his lineage, identifying a main lineage of a pursuer, linked to hunters of the Zahar family, but she also noticed another lineage mixed in. That meant Turan was the result of two different lineages, though the second one was sealed, something not uncommon when lineages mix. She explained that as he grew stronger, that lineage would eventually reveal itself naturally. Upon hearing this, Turan thought that his mother might have been more than she seemed, as she was far too educated and refined to be just a commoner, perhaps descended from some noble, even if her lineage had weakened to the point of no longer manifesting powers. After better understanding the true nature of the librarian, Turan began to make much better use of his time in the library. He didn't just read but started asking many questions, seeking explanations on different subjects. The librarian showed knowledge even of books that were no longer there, whether they had been looted or lost over time. She taught him basic principles of nature, and thus Turan learned that many diseases arise from microorganisms, that decomposition occurs because germs feed on bodies, and he also came to understand concepts such as light refraction, heat generated by friction, and even the processes of injury and recovery in living beings. With this new knowledge, Turan began testing things in practice, starting with decomposition. He touched an apple, and it rotted instantly, which left him impressed. He realized it wasn't impossible to do that with ordinary magic, but understanding the principle behind it allowed him to use far less mana. Thus, his magic evolved significantly, simply because he had changed the way he viewed the world. He even considered that powerful families might hide this kind of knowledge, precisely to maintain an advantage, since if all mages knew this, they would lose that edge. The librarian agreed, saying that this explained why people's level of knowledge had been decreasing over time, and that it made sense as a theory. Later, Turan decided it was time to leave, as the owner of that place was already giving clear signs that he should not stay any longer. The librarian, however, asked to go with him, but ended up simply passing through his body, since she couldn't leave. When he asked if she could actually leave, she admitted she couldn't, and then tried to convince him to stay, saying she would take good care of him, but he refused. Before he left, she explained that on that continent there were many legacies of the gods, including other spirits like her, and suggested that he talk to some of them in the future, since he might find spirits with even greater knowledge. Turan said he would return to visit her, and although she pretended not to care, he remarked that there were still many books left for him to read there. After that, departing from Orin, Turan remembered that, according to the complete map of the continent he had found in the library, the Enhul Desert, the base of the Zahar family, lay to the east. He decided to head in that direction to try to find clues about his parents, but without haste. Along the way, he traveled calmly, got to know the region better, camped, faced monsters, and absorbed their mana, also thinking that if any clues still existed, they wouldn't disappear suddenly, since 18 years had already passed. On one of those days of travel, Turan came across a strange situation. A gigantic horse, some kind of beast, was protecting its fallen master while two dark elves attacked it. They seemed surprised by the animal's strength, questioning how a mere pet could be so powerful, while one of them suggested simply creating an opening to strike. Soon after, they began chanting magic, using necromancy and summoning malevolent spirits. Watching this, Turan hesitated about whether he should help, thinking that perhaps the man had provoked the attack first, but he soon realized that those dark elves were cannibals. Faced with this, Turan decided to act, hiding himself with his magic while observing. At the moment the elves were distracted, one of them suddenly had their head destroyed, causing the summoned spirits to disappear instantly. The other elf managed to defend herself using her own spirits, blocking the next attack with with one of them, and immediately ordered them to find whoever was responsible. She then summoned a monstrous bull, which began smashing through trees as it searched, but found nothing. Realizing it was a case of concealment, she summoned another spirit capable of revealing presences in the area. With that, she managed to locate Turan, which surprised him for a moment, but he reacted quickly, destroying the first spirit with a burst of fire while dodging the bull's attack, albeit with difficulty. In the middle of the fight, without noticing, his leg ended up being bitten by a fox. That created an opening, and Turan was struck head-on by the bull's horns, being hurled violently against a tree. The dark elf began laughing at the situation, mocking him and saying that now he would have to beg for death. But before she could do anything further, she was suddenly hit hard by the giant mare, taking a direct blow to the head and being practically crushed by the animal's strength. Even so, the fight was not over, because all the summoned spirits turned against the mare, taking advantage of the moment when she was exposed. In that instant of distraction, the dark elf was precisely struck by a stone launched from Turan's sling. He had managed to react even while severely injured. With her death, the spirits lost their form and returned to being mere shadows, disappearing shortly afterward. The mare remained unharmed, but Turan was in critical condition, so badly injured that he almost fainted on the spot. Even so, the animal approached him, showing gratitude for the help. Sometime later, the man who had been protected woke up in a panic, but realized he was safe, near a lit campfire, beside Turan. Confused, he asked who his savior was, and Turan explained that he had seen the Dark Elves attack and decided to help him. The mare, called Tilly, approached her owner as if confirming the story, showing that she truly recognized Turan as an ally. He commented that she was extremely intelligent, capable even of understanding her owner's needs and moving to ensure his safety. The man then expressed deep gratitude for the help and introduced himself as Aziz Burke, a member of the Burke family. After that, Turan asked if there was any reason for the conflict with the Dark Elves, and Aziz Burke explained that there was none, that he had simply been on a pilgrimage with his servants when he was suddenly attacked. He remarked that he had heard that other races could be violent, but he had not imagined it would be so extreme. Visibly shaken, he revealed that he had lost very important people in that attack, knights and servants who had been with him since childhood and had practically raised him. Perceiving the situation, Turan concluded that he was a good person and informed him that he had killed the two Dark Elves. Aziz Burke replied that there were probably no more enemies nearby, but to be sure, Turan used his tracking magic and confirmed that there were no more hostile presences in the surroundings. The next morning, they buried all the bodies, and Aziz Burke commented that deep down he wished he could send them all back to their homeland, but he knew that would be difficult. Turan agreed, saying it really wouldn't be simple. Even so, Aziz Burke thanked him for the help and also for not laughing at the situation, since, for a noble, crying over the sacrifice of one's own subordinates could seem strange. That mindset, in fact, came from his father's teachings, who said that those who die in a just battle go to the celestial palace with the gods, and that mourning would be a sign of weakness. A true noble should move forward despite the sacrifices. Even so, Aziz Burke admitted that if being strong meant not suffering over the death of someone close, then he would probably never be strong. Turan replied that it wasn't weakness but kindness, and from that point on, Aziz Burke suggested they speak more casually, since they would be traveling together and didn't seem to have much of an age difference. Thus, the two began to consider each other friends, with Turan confirming that he could count on him from then on. Later, during a rest stop, Aziz Burke showed a refrigerated box where he stored plenty of food from the last city. Turan found the cold interior unusual, and Aziz Burke explained that it allowed food to be preserved for about a week without any problems, as long as it was reheated if it got too cold. He also showed other magical items, such as one that released water at the press of a button, another that automatically created a shelter when supplied with wood, one that emitted an alarm when someone approached, and even the clothes he was wearing, which had a self-cleaning function. Turan found all of this impressive, since magical items were not usually so common, and commented that the clothes alone would already be enough payment for saving his life. Aziz Burke, however, disagreed, saying they weren't worth that much, and promised to reward him with something far better when they returned home, even if he had to make it himself. In addition, he remarked that nothing surpassed what Turan was capable of, since during the journey he had seen various types of magic being used, such as animal manipulation, freezing, levitation, liquid control, enhancement, light emission, and restraint. With that, Aziz Burke asked whether he had spent his entire life practicing magic, or if he possessed some kind of special bloodline ability that allowed him to learn any kind of magic. Turan answered vaguely, saying it simply happened, and reminded him that they had agreed not to investigate each other's origins. Aziz Burke joked that such an ability probably shouldn't even exist, and then asked his age. Based on his appearance, he thought he wasn't even 30 years old, maybe around 80 at most. Turan revealed that he was less than a month away from turning 19, which surprised Aziz Burke, who said he was 43, concluding that a 24-year difference wasn't that significant. He then reflected that he should have realized this earlier, especially when Turan mentioned defeating two necromancers, and commented that it was impressive impressive that another genius of that level existed. When Turan asked about this other, Aziz Burke explained that they weren't exactly at the same level, but he knew someone similar, a second cousin. Upon hearing that, Turan asked if he could request that person to make a magical item, but Aziz Burke explained that she wasn't part of his direct lineage, but rather from the main family. He then revealed that he was referring to the Princess of Badal Arabian, someone who would likely become the leader of the great lineage in the future. Unlike ordinary families, in these great lineages succession was not guaranteed to the patriarch's child, since there were many relatives of the same generation, and someone stronger would always emerge. Even so, this princess had been born with exceptional talent, and, in just 10 years after awakening her powers, had mastered bloodline magic in all forms of combat, earning the family's full support. Her magical power was already approaching that of the main members. Turan questioned whether she had received any kind of special support, and Aziz Burke confirmed that she had, mentioning that she inherited magical power from a deceased great-uncle, although other members also received a portion. From that, Turan concluded that this was one of the reasons great lineages remained at the top of society. Shortly after, Aziz Burke announced that they were arriving, presenting the plains of Decane, the central territory of Badal Arabian. They then continued toward the Burke family's territory, called Zabalin. Upon arrival, Aziz Burke's mother welcomed them with great concern, and when he hugged her, Turan once again found himself questioning his age. Soon after, his father appeared, telling him to mind his manners and at least address his mother properly. Then Aziz Burke introduced Turan as his traveling companion, a new friend from the south, and the benefactor who had risked his life to save him. He made it clear that without that help, he wouldn't have been able to return home. His mother then asked what had happened, and he explained that they had been attacked by dark elf necromancers. Outraged, she questioned how those creatures dared to do such a thing, and declared that she would personally lead an army against them, while his father calmed her, reminding her that they were being watched. Soon after, his father asked Turan which family he came from, and he replied that it was hard to say, since even he didn't know for sure. He explained that he had been born to a commoner mother and did not know his father, which surprised Aziz Burke, who hadn't known that part of the story. Turan said it wasn't something he was proud of, but even so, Aziz Burke's mother declared that since he had saved her son, the Burke family would grant him the reward he deserved, and that he was welcome. Still, she explained that it would be difficult to accommodate him in the mansion, so they would prepare the best lodging in the city for him. Aziz Burke didn't like that idea very much, and asked why they couldn't host him in their own home, but his mother apologized and explained that an important guest was currently staying there, and they couldn't simply allow a stranger to enter. At that moment, the guest appeared, saying that if it was because of her, there was no problem. She didn't believe that someone who had saved Aziz Burke would suddenly try to assassinate her. This person was Mesa, and when Turan looked at her, he thought she looked more like a corpse than a princess. She explained that she was there because she had recently suffered an assassination attempt by the so-called Zahar worms, and had decided to hide for a while. Aziz Burke was outraged at the idea of an assassination attempt happening within the main house, especially with such a strict defense system in place. However, Mesa replied that there was likely a traitor among them, since quite a few members of the family disliked her. After that, she withdrew to rest, and Aziz Burke's mother decided to prepare the second best room in the house for Turan. That night, Turan slept well, and the next morning, waking up early, he found Aziz Burke in the corridors. Surprised to see him awake so early, Aziz Burke asked what he was doing there. Turan explained that he was just observing a magical lamp, and Aziz Burke commented that this kind of item was common, as it was usually made during enchantment training in childhood. He even offered one to Turan, since he had several to spare. Turan felt he didn't need that many, but suddenly, a lightning bolt struck the courtyard, catching both of their attention. Aziz Burke explained that it was Mesa training magic, something common for her, as she was extremely dedicated. Impressed, Turan asked if that was the Bede al-Arabian bloodline, and Aziz Burke confirmed it, saying it was the Storm lineage, something that even he, who had never hated his own blood, couldn't help but envy, as it seemed almost divine. This further sparked Turan's curiosity, and he wanted to see with his own eyes how strong the heir of the next generation was, though he felt it might not be appropriate for a stranger to approach. Even so, Aziz Burke said it wouldn't be a problem, since he clearly wasn't an assassin. He also admitted he was curious himself, as he wanted to see who was stronger between Turan and Mesa. Years ago, he had trained with her, and still carried the frustration of that experience, wishing at least to see her defeated once. Later, Turan approached and introduced himself, and Mesa asked what they were doing there. Aziz Burke casually replied that they had seen her training and wanted to join in, reminding her that they had done so before. Mesa confirmed, recalling that on that previous occasion, he had tried for an entire week to do something she accomplished in just 2 attempts, which had made him leave in tears. He asked her not to bring that up, while even Turan ended up laughing at the situation. Then Aziz Burke shifted the focus and said that Turan was easily one of the most talented mages he had ever seen, even calling him a monster, and suggested that the two of them fight. Mesa analyzed him for a few moments, and shortly after, she had already summoned a storm, causing something to press against Turan's mind. He grew tense and began to break into a cold sweat. Noticing this, she apologized and concluded that he didn't yet seem to be at the level to face face her directly. Aziz Burke then explained that it wasn't about raw magical power, since in that regard she was clearly ahead, but emphasized that Turan's advantage lay in his absurd learning ability. Intrigued by his insistence, Mesa asked what exactly he wanted to demonstrate, and Turan proposed a different kind of challenge. Each of them would show a spell the other likely didn't know, and whoever could reproduce it faster would win. The idea pleased both Aziz Burke and Mesa, but she raised a concern, asking if it was true that he didn't know his own bloodline, since it would be unfair for her to use her innate magic. Even so, she decided to start. She stepped forward, and suddenly vines and roots sprouted from the ground, completely wrapping around Aziz Burke and lifting him into the air. Mesa explained that it was a magic of plant creation and manipulation, and asked whether Turan could do the same, while Aziz Burke, hanging there, asked to be let down because he was starting to feel dizzy. Ignoring his request for the moment, she said it was fun. Turan then focused, placing his hand on the ground and analyzing the phenomenon. To him, creating fire was simply manifesting combustion, and creating water was extracting moisture from the air. So those vines weren't exactly creation, but rather the accelerated growth of seeds already present in the soil. With that understanding, he managed to reproduce the magic, albeit with a different color due to his mana. Misa was surprised, saying that he had immediately grasped the true nature of the magic, and asked if he had done that before. He replied that it was his first attempt. Faced with that, she remarked that it was extremely rare. Then it was Turan's turn to propose the challenge. He grew a bit tense, since using certain spells would be too risky, so he decided to improvise. He summoned a small animal, and Mesa initially thought it was nothing special, but he explained that it was only the ingredient. With a simple touch, he completely decomposed the rat, demonstrating an unusual kind of magic, and asked if she could do the same. Mesa accepted the challenge and tried to replicate it, but failed, becoming confused about the method used, while Aziz Burke commented that it was somewhat disgusting. Even so, Turan already suspected that this ability was rare, perhaps even unknown, even among great lineages. Aziz Burke suggested giving the victory to Turan, but Mesa refused to accept defeat and decided to persist. She explained that magic involves complex factors, such as the naturalness of the phenomenon, understanding its cause, and the amount of mana used, with perception of the cause being one of the most important factors for efficiency. When that understanding fails, it is possible to compensate by using more mana, and that was exactly what she did. Consuming a large amount of energy, she managed to reproduce the decomposition, though much more slowly than Turan. In the end, however, the excessive effort left her completely exhausted, causing her to faint. Turan realized that she had used too much mana, but he also found it strange, since that normally wouldn't cause a complete faint, at most, exhaustion. Looking more closely, he noticed details in her clothing, such as her gloves, and began to suspect that she might be ill. He asked if there was a healing mage nearby, but Aziz Burke said there wasn't, so Turan asked for water and salt to be taken to her room. As he carried her, he noticed how light she was, even lighter than a lamb, and also that the mana she used to keep herself active had been completely depleted. When Misa woke up, she saw Aziz Burke's mother by her side, clearly worried and asking if she was conscious. Aziz Burke explained that she had suddenly fainted during training with a guest, raising suspicion about whether something had been done to her, but he decided to just observe for now. Misa denied it, saying it was just her own mistake, and asked everyone to leave. Aziz Burke's mother mentioned that she had prepared soup, even knowing that Misa barely ate because of her magic, and left the dish there before leaving. Misa thanked her, but when she took a sip, she was overwhelmed by disturbing memories, people begging for mercy and writhing in pain, causing her to drop the bowl immediately, like someone who had been tormented by this for a long time. Meanwhile, Turan was in the underground section of the Burke family estate, inside a temple dedicated to the goddess Manga, accompanied by a knight named Haram Burke. He explained that all the walls and doors in that place were extremely solid, without any gaps, comparing them to muscles trained over hundreds of years, making escape virtually impossible. Turan didn't quite understand the point of that explanation, but simply observed as Haram Burke continued emphasizing just how solid, resistant, and unyielding the place truly was. Suddenly, Haram Burke began to train, swinging his sword with extreme precision and without wasting a single movement, until he noticed Turan watching him. He then asked what he thought, and Turan replied that the movements seemed very good. Haram Burke said that was to be expected, since most nobles considered martial arts insignificant, preferring to attack from a distance with magic, mainly because they had weak bodies and couldn't master their own physique, relying only on tricks. Turan reflected that unless it was a bloodline focused on physical combat, like the Hercules lineage, prioritizing magical power was generally more efficient, though he acknowledged that in extreme situations, there were challenges that couldn't be avoided. At that moment, Haram Burke told Turan to pick up a sword immediately. Turan found it strange, since he had been kept there under suspicion and was now being handed a weapon, but Haram Burke explained that it was just a piece of iron. The true essence of a sword lay in the body of the one who wielded it. According to him, with Turan's current physical condition, there was no risk at all. Turan tried to use the sword while concentrating mana, but was immediately corrected. Haram Burke said not to involve mana, adjusting his posture, correcting the position of his legs, the firmness of his footing, the angle of his elbow, and the support of his arm, making making it clear that with such a weak stance he could even injure himself. Without realizing it, Turan began training under his guidance, as if he had been taken in as a disciple. Meanwhile, Hiram Burke continued insisting that mana was nothing more than a trick, and that many mages believed they had physical security when, in reality, they only used the bare minimum their bodies could offer. To him, a well-trained body could cross a battlefield without relying on mana, and Turan needed to understand that difference. Turan said he would keep that in mind. At that moment, Aziz Burke's mother entered the temple and said she had been rude to Turan, mistreating someone who had saved her son. Turan also apologized, saying that as a guest his conduct hadn't been appropriate, but she explained that Mesa wanted to apologize to him personally. Later the two met, and Mesa said she had heard that he had been confined in the temple because of her, apologizing for the situation. Turan replied that he was just glad she was well. Then Mesa brought up the magic he had used to decompose the animal, saying it seemed like something from an unknown lineage, especially due to its high mana consumption, and raised the suspicion that he might be deceiving others. Turan explained that wasn't the case, and that anyone could do the same if they understood the principle behind the technique. Mesa then challenged him, asking whether he intended to teach it for free, since without revealing the method, there was no way to prove it wasn't a bloodline ability. Turan said he didn't care about the outcome of the competition, but she refused to leave it at that, and proposed a deal. If he revealed the secret of the magic, she would teach him a secret technique of battle Arabian. Turan accepted, considering it a fair trade. After hearing his detailed explanation, Mesa concluded that, at its core, he was using a form of biological enhancement applied to invisible microorganisms, something she herself used unconsciously, which explained her low efficiency. She admitted she had lost, since she had only managed to reproduce the technique through brute force. Turan said he considered that part of the wager, but she disagreed, stating that magic isn't usually evaluated based solely on large amounts of mana, and suggested to Aziz Burke that they call it a draw, preventing Turan from getting conceited. Trying to recover her pride, Mesa demonstrated a simple trick with static electricity using a comb, but Turan was already familiar with it, which annoyed her even more, since she considered that kind of knowledge advanced. Unable to surpass him at that moment, she said she would think of another way to compensate him, and suggested they continue training together, making it clear it was only to repay the debt. Turan agreed, and they decided to meet every day at dusk in the garden. Later, during dinner, Aziz Burke was surprised by the amount of food, saying it was more extravagant than even his birthday, but his mother told him to be quiet. Turan realized it wasn't an ordinary meal, and soon Aziz Burke's mother returned to the previous topic, saying she had heard about the promise of a reward made by her son, and asked if he had any specific request. Turan said he would like something focused on defense, since attacking with magic is easier than protecting oneself, especially against surprise attacks. She replied that such items were common for them, although they didn't have anything ready at the moment. Aziz Burke offered to craft the artifact himself, but another person interrupted, saying that if he didn't want to embarrass the family, he should give up. That person took on the task, explaining that he had just finished a request for the main house and had some free time. He suggested creating something discreet, like a ring, earring, or necklace, capable of automatically injecting mana and activating a defensive effect from the guardian lineage in case of danger, estimating about a month to complete it. Aziz Burke's father commented that he didn't like to boast about his children, but revealed that Marvin Valtis already possessed abilities comparable to those of a family head, which meant Turan would receive an artifact of extremely high level. Turan felt grateful, but questioned whether that wasn't too much, and Aziz Burke's mother replied that it wasn't, because anything less would diminish the value of her son's life. With that, it was decided that Turan would remain as a guest of the family during that period. Later, while walking through the streets of Zabalan, Aziz Burke mentioned that his mother had taken an interest in Turan, noting that she had spoken about him before going to sleep, highlighting both his magical talent and his dedication to training. He explained that his initial intention had only been to prevent her from underestimating him due to his lack of family support, but Turan realized that it sounded more like a recruitment attempt. Aziz Burke confirmed that this was how things worked, first offering benefits, then creating pressure, and finally trying to bind the person to the family, often by presenting a potential partner. Even so, he assured him that no one would force him into anything just for accepting the artifact. In the end, Aziz Burke asked whether Turan had any plans for the moment, and he replied that he would only be training with the princess in the afternoon. So Aziz Burke pointed out that they still had plenty of time, and suggested they go on a patrol around the city together, commenting that even though it wasn't the capital, Zabalan still had a lot to offer. He asked whether, on such a beautiful day, it made sense to stay locked in a room just training, and Turan replied that yes, that was exactly what he had been thinking. Even so, Aziz Burke decided to drag him out to enjoy life, first taking him to a casino, where Turan refused to participate, then to a rather unsanitary bar, where he also chose not to stay. During the outing, however, Turan came across a city notice board displaying an image of Kiorn, someone he would recognize anywhere, and it immediately caught his attention. Because of that, he decided to attend a play that told the story of that night, set around the year 2195, when the warriors of Battle Arabian marched toward the Desert of Demons, highlighting Kieran's figure, who, with divine assistance, managed to defeat an enemy after an extremely difficult battle. battle. After the performance ended and the audience applauded, Aziz Burke asked whether it had been worth watching, and Turan replied that it had been good. However, it also reminded him that Kiorn himself claimed to be just an ordinary knight, which showed how humble his master was. He then thought that if he ever met him again, he would ask whether that story was truly accurate. The following morning, Turan woke up to Haram Burke staring at him, asking whether he had rested well in that body. After confirming that he had, Turan asked the reason for the visit. Haram Burke explained that he had noticed the potential of his body the previous day and invited him to train, saying that the body does not grow stronger through rest, but by being forged, making it clear that he would only refuse if Turan himself didn't want to go. Even so, Turan accepted, recognizing that it would be far more productive than doing nothing. When Aziz Burke entered the room calling for Turan, he found his uncle there, and Haram Burke commented that he was taking Turan to train, provoking Aziz Burke by asking whether he wouldn't also strengthen that weak body of his. Aziz Burke, clearly unwilling, said he had just returned from the city and was tired, quickly leaving the room, which confused Turan at the time, though it would make sense later. During training, while doing inclined push-ups with weights on his back, Turan heard Haram Burke ask whether he could feel his body screaming, emphasizing that he should not give in to such minor pain, as his mind was being dominated by physical weakness. When he finished, Turan was quite exhausted, and Haram Burke explained that even so, he was still a mage and should consider himself lucky to go through that only once. A normal body, even after being trained, weakens over time and needs to be constantly tested, whereas mages, thanks to mana, can maintain their bodies in an ideal state, like steel that does not deteriorate. Without giving him much rest, Haram Burke asked whether he had recovered enough, and even though Turan said it had only been a few seconds, he insisted that the body does not lie, and that it was enough, then began teaching hand-to-hand combat techniques. Because of this, Turan's routine within the Burke family became extremely intense. In the morning, he trained his body with Haram Burke. At dusk, he returned to the mansion to practice magic with Mesa, and in between he still spent time with Aziz Burke, until, without realizing it, 3 weeks had already passed. During one of these sessions, while practicing lightning magic, Turan missed the target again, which caught the princess's attention. She commented that such difficulty was unusual for someone like him. Turan justified it by saying that he was not from Baydal Arabian, and Mesa replied that she could not help much, as she had never needed to aim lightning magic in that way. At that moment, a guard approached to deliver a message, showing some discomfort at Turan's presence, but Mesa told him to speak quickly, as she had already made it clear that no one from the main house should approach. The guard then reported that the head of the family had summoned her, as the Dark Elves had launched a major offensive in the south and had already taken 3 cities, and an expedition was being organized. Upon hearing this, Turan realized that the elves had reappeared, while Mesa understood the gravity of the situation and said she needed to depart, adding that she would still collect the price for the decomposition magic he had shown. She then asked whether he knew that electricity also flowed through the human body, and upon receiving a negative answer, explained that it was a secret of Bad al-Arabian, proposing to consider the debt settled if he learned that concept properly. She explained that when a person sees, feels, or smells something, small electrical charges are sent to the brain, which interprets the information and sends commands back to the body so it can move. At first, Turan had difficulty understanding, but he realized it resembled concepts he had seen in library books, perhaps another law of nature. Mesa then asked what would happen if that electricity were accelerated with magic, and Turan concluded that perception and reaction would increase, which she confirmed, praising his reasoning, and saying he could even become an academic. Curious, she decided to demonstrate, and Turan closed his eyes, focusing on the idea of an electrical current running through his body, trying to accelerate those signals with mana. When he succeeded, he noticed that everything around him seemed to slow down, as if in slow motion, but the effect came with a strong headache that interrupted the spell. Misa explained that he had failed by using mana recklessly, and that because of the pain, it would be difficult to adapt at that moment, but that over time he would be able to maintain the technique for longer periods. Reflecting on this, Turan commented that it seemed like knowledge far too valuable compared to what he had offered, but Mesa replied that she saw it as an investment, since he showed talent, and that she would collect in the future if he learned even more impressive spells. With that, she departed on her urgent mission. A few days later, in the city of Morgaine, located in the center of the Daikin Plains, a large crowd gathered to watch the departure of the mages and knights of Battle Arabian, turning what should have been just a mission to hunt dark elves into something resembling a parade. Aziz Burke commented on this as he observed the movement, and soon pointed to Misa, who was mounted on a horse, waving excitedly at her, until his father reprimanded him, telling him to maintain the proper posture of a noble. At that moment, the head of the family finally appeared, and Turan, upon observing him, remarked to Aziz Burke that he didn't look very well, noting his pale complexion and wondering if he was ill. Aziz Burke replied that he had heard rumors that the family head had been severely injured in the past during a battle against the leader of House Zahar, but since that had happened long ago, his current appearance might simply be a consequence of old age. Even so, at that moment, Badal Arabian raised his hand and summoned extremely dense clouds, forming a completely dark sky that blocked out the sunlight. Then he encouraged everyone to advance with confidence, reminding them that this was the power that protected them. Thunder soon began to echo across the sky, illuminating everything with intense lightning strikes. Even with his seemingly weakened body, Badal Arabian managed to cover a vast area with lightning, demonstrating a level of magic that represented the peak a human could reach, which made Turan think that one day he would reach that level as well. Later, the eldest member of the Burke family handed Turan an artifact, explaining that simply using it would already slightly increase his physical resistance, and that by injecting mana this effect would become even greater, reaching a level close to that of nobles from the Guardian lineage. However, he warned that the mana consumption was very high, so it wasn't something to keep active for long. Turan was impressed and learned that an item of that level was rare even among great families, being considered exceptional. Soon after, Aziz Burke's mother asked if he had any interest in formally joining the family, but Turan replied that although it was an offer he was very grateful for, it would be difficult to accept, since he had many goals and could not tie himself to one place. She showed understanding, saying she had already heard stories about him through Aziz Burke, and that it made sense for someone like him to have difficulty settling down, while Turan stated that he would never forget the hospitality he had received, considering Aziz Burke and the entire Burke family as friends forever. At the time of farewell, Aziz Burke and Haram Burke were waiting for him, and Haram Burke handed him a knife that functioned as a magical device, without many special features but extremely durable and very sharp, which made Turan thank his master. Shortly after, Aziz Burke threw a cloak over Turan's shoulders, reminding him that he had once mentioned envying his clothes, explaining that the cloak did not get dirty easily and could regenerate if it suffered minor damage. In addition, he also gave him a shirt and a pair of pants, emphasizing that he considered him a good friend, not just for saving his life, but for the time they had spent together, which had also helped him improve in magic and rethink his own life. Before parting ways, he asked where Turan intended to go, and he replied that he would head east first. Aziz Burke commented that he had already traveled as far as Carmen and advised avoiding sea travel, as the waves were very strong, although Turan knew he would have to face them to reach Zahar, choosing not to mention it. Even so, Aziz Burke said that someone as stubborn as him wouldn't starve out there, and asked him to return safely and pay for the cloak in the future. Sometime later, Turan was traveling alone again and decided to run for a while, quickly passing through a line of people like a rocket, crossing various landscapes until he reached a forest in a short time. It was then that he noticed the smell of smoke, stronger than usual, as if something was burning, and upon investigating, he found a village completely destroyed by fire, with several bodies tied to wooden posts, completely charred. This led him to think it might have been a bandit attack, since it was unlikely that dark elves would have reached that far. While examining the place, Turan noticed an intact trapdoor in one of the houses, and upon opening it, he found a little girl who panicked upon seeing him. He tried to calm her, explaining that he was not an enemy and that he was there to help, asking what had happened. The girl managed to say that a mage had killed everyone before fainting, and Turan realized she was not seriously injured, just exhausted from being trapped for so long. He thought about taking her somewhere safe, but as he emerged from the trapdoor, he was confronted by a woman aiming an ice arrow directly at him, ordering him to kneel and accusing him of setting the village on fire, massacring the inhabitants, and even kidnapping the child. At the same time, other knights surrounded him, preparing fire attacks, and even though Turan tried to explain that it was a misunderstanding, the situation spiraled out of control and the attacks were launched. Despite the concern that a child was present, the attacks struck Turan, but when the smoke cleared, he was completely unharmed, without a single burn, astonishing everyone around him. He then realized that he had been forced to use the artifact he had received earlier, much sooner than expected, making it clear that it was no ordinary item. The archer, surprised, tried to understand what kind of defensive magic that was, while Turan once again explained that he was not responsible for the attack, reinforcing that it was a misunderstanding and warning that if he were attacked again, he would not remain on the defensive. Faced with this, the archer analyzed the situation more carefully, noticing that the child had no injuries, which made no sense if he were the culprit, and decided to introduce herself as Bissen, admitting that the situation did not seem consistent. Even so, she questioned how she could trust him, considering that all the evidence pointed otherwise, and Turan suggested that they ask the girl when she woke up, since she had seen the real culprit. Surprised, Bissen wanted to know more, and he explained that the girl had mentioned a mage, although she did not know the details. Then Bissen revealed that they had been searching for an arsonist, a mysterious mage who had been attacking isolated villages for months, tying up and burning the inhabitants alive, leaving no survivors, which made it impossible even to determine their gender, being known only by that nickname. When the girl woke up, she confirmed that the culprit wore a red cloak, had a beard, and looked like a lumberjack, which led the knights to compare him with with Turan, clearly realizing their mistake, since he didn't even have a beard. Faced with this, Beeson and the other knights apologized, admitting that they had acted hastily in pointing their weapons at him. Turan reflected that even among nobles there were those who let their sense of duty override reason, but he acknowledged that their initial concern for the child's safety was what truly mattered. He then asked whether they were there specifically to capture the arsonist, and Beeson confirmed, explaining that upon finding someone at the recently destroyed site, they believed they had finally found the culprit. Now, with a clearer description, she believed it would be easier to track him down, especially since they had a tracker in the group. Curious, Turan asked whether that tracker belonged to the Zahar family, but Beeson explained that she did not. She was from the Carmen family, and they had come from Yabisha, accompanied by members of vassal families. She also mentioned that the tracker's ancestors had mixed their blood with nobles of the Zahar family, resulting in a special lineage that had eventually awakened. Finally, Beeson made a request to Turan, asking if he could help hunt down the arsonist, offering a reward or even part of her own mana, as she needed to accumulate merit. Turan then asked about the mage's level of power, and Beeson replied that he was certainly at the level of a noble, since even in villages protected by several knights, everyone had been killed without exception. Turan realized that this was exactly the kind of opponent he needed at that moment to test his strength, as fighting weak demonic beasts by the roadside was no longer helping him improve. Because of this, he agreed to help, but made it clear that he first needed to ensure the child's safety. Sometime later, he took the girl to a nearby village and left her under the care of the local chief, giving enough money to raise her until adulthood and demanding that they take very good care of her, stating that he would return in the future to check. Turan's firm tone and attitude left the village chief quite intimidated. After that, they returned to the destroyed village along with the tracker, who began searching for clues using only mana, though it took some time before she found a reliable trail. When she finally did, the group followed her into the forest, observing every detail as she carefully analyzed the surroundings, smelling the air and examining the ground. Curious, Turan asked how tracking worked, and she explained that she had started by looking for human footprints and, upon reaching the main road, began following the scent of ash, since the criminal likely still carried residue on his body from not having changed clothes. This made Turan realize how experienced she was, understanding that earlier he hadn't found anything simply because there were no clues. After some time, the tracker indicated that she had found the location, and the group arrived at the entrance of a cave. With Beeson and Turan at the front, they advanced cautiously, and when questioned, the tracker confirmed that there was someone inside. Upon reaching the back of the cave, they found an improvised setup with an altar, a campfire, and a crude bed, as well as an elderly man wearing a red hood, with a sickly appearance and clearly unstable behavior. The man asked what had brought them to such an isolated place, while the tracker confidently stated that it was him. Even so, Beeson decided to confirm and directly asked whether he was responsible for kidnapping and burning the villagers. In response, the mage launched a burst of fire that struck the knights, but Turan and Beeson were protected by the artifact's shield. Taking advantage of the opening, the archer shot the mage in the leg, knocking him down, but he still reacted by using earth manipulation to create giant hands that tried to crush them. Even so, Turan managed to dodge and, using his sling, delivered a blow that tore off the enemy's arm, and shortly after, with a simple snap of his fingers, he stopped the man's heart, causing immediate cardiac arrest. After neutralizing the opponent, Turan scattered seeds around the body and made them grow with magic, creating vines that completely restrained the arsonist, limiting his movements and vision, preventing any attempt at casting. With the enemy practically defeated, he pressed a knife to his neck and ordered him to remain still, threatening to kill him if he released any mana. Confused, the arsonist asked who they were and how they had found him, and Turan replied that he had his own methods, pressing him to confirm whether he was responsible for the attacks. When he remained silent, Turan injured his leg to force an answer, and demanded to know why a wandering noble was burning people alive in that region. The man then revealed that he was acting according to the will of his god, believing that by burning the flesh and souls of sinners, he could draw closer to this entity. According to him, this god had taught him a secret to obtain the power of other bloodlines, and that by continuing to burn humans, he would eventually acquire an incendiary lineage. Bison immediately rejected the idea, calling it madness and stating that it was impossible for someone to obtain an innate bloodline in such a way. However, Turan remembered what Medan had said earlier about ordinary people being able to become mages by killing demonic beasts, which made him reconsider the possibility. As the arsonist insisted that he needed only a few more victims to achieve that power, Turan began to think that this might not be just the delusion of an insane man, but rather a hint of a real secret about how that world functioned.